author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Crime ravages the country, and yet the progressive policies just keep on coming. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we have a great lineup for you today, talking ultra-progressives failing at the ballot box, the Wizard of Oz economy, French and US relations since D-Day, and your rights and your freedoms in our special Talking Liberty segment. I want to take a brief moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Brownwood, Texas on KXYL 1240 AM, 102.3 FM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Progressives are taking hit after hit at the ballot box, but what does it all portend? We're lucky enough to be joined by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, to dive deep into the consequences of an ultra-progressive Democratic Party. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Thanks, Mark. Delighted to be here.
So first questions first, Tim. Based on the primaries so far that we've had, is the radical left failing to take over the Democratic Party?
I would say the word would be, just as you said, failing, not failed, because there's still a chance that they can come back in the 2024 political cycle. Within the Democratic Party, progressives have lost certainly more than they won in these primaries. Rank and file Democratic voters are very skeptical of the radical solutions proposed by progressives in general. So they've lost more than they've won, but they haven't been fully repudiated within the Democratic Party. But Mark, the question is, what happens when their progressives go up against Republicans in a general election? And generally speaking, as I wrote on LibertyNation.com, the downfall of progressive Democrats could be just around the corner when you consider the disgraced exit of the district attorney in San Francisco, Chesa Boudin, who was thoroughly repudiated. And I think even though that's not a congressional seat, it portends the same thing for Democrats. Rank and file voters, normal Americans, are fed up with soft on crime policies and generally believe we need the opposite.
Yeah, I think that ties in quite nicely with my follow-up on that, because it seems that we can see from the numbers that rank and file Democrats are outperforming generally the ultra-progressives here. But it hasn't stopped lawmakers, specifically Joe Biden, those in the Senate and the House, with their progressive wish list, which confuses me a little. So surely if voters don't want the candidates who espouse the policies, then they don't want the policies at all, do they?
Well, I don't think that Joe Biden really had the backbone to stand up to his progressive wing. He has adopted many of their most insane positions, such as a total end to fossil fuel, which is what he proposed multiple times during the presidential campaign. The media chose to overlook it once he got into the general election campaign and tried to deny that he had said that. But his Build Back Better plan is a full socialist, democratic socialist takeover of a constitutional republic. So he has adopted the principles that scare the bejesus out of the American people, and the opposite of what got him elected. He got elected because he thought he was a reliable, conventionally liberal Democrat. But as I've said, he was elected like George Bush, but he's governing like FDR, trying to. Yeah. He thinks he has some mandate to overturn. I mean, it's the first time in almost 50 years in his public life, Mark, Joe Biden never once even hinted that America was systemically racist. Then during the campaign, suddenly his third presidential campaign since 1988, he suddenly says we're systemically racist. He's sold out because he has no backbone to stand up to the progressives, and it's going to damage the party deeply. It already has.
Yeah, I think Democrat voters specifically, were quite shocked because, as you point out, during the primaries for the presidential nominee there, Joe Biden was the bulwark against which the progressives were slamming themselves. And this is why he won, because he was holding back that tide of progressive ideology. And then all of a sudden...
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, please carry on. All of a sudden, he gets into office and he's trying to deal out their wish list. So he's not governing what he was elected to do, not only by the party faithful, but by the progressives as well.
Joe Biden ran a terrible primary campaign in 2020. He was losing. He was getting his butt handed to him in primary after primary until he was rescued in South Carolina by the black voters there who gave him his first victory, his first taste of anything but pure defeat in his quest for the presidency. The only reason he got the nomination was because there was nobody else. Yeah. And they could not put Bernie Sanders forward because he, again, would frighten the American people with his ideas on completely overturning the culture and the economy, the politics, and everything. Biden would have had no chance if there was even a candidate with much of a pulse going against him who wasn't a socialist, but there wasn't. So they cleared the field for him. I mean, they basically ran the other candidates off the Democratic hierarchy to clear the field for Biden. And, he won as not Trump. But that's all he won as. He wasn't Trump, and he represented stability in his...
Allegedly.
Allegedly, and in his inaugural talked about nothing but unity, and since then has advanced nothing but division with all of his statements, his policies that demonize Republicans. That's not unity.
Well, let's jump onto that briefly, Tim, if you may. So Joe Biden, he's been trying to coin the phrase ultra MAGA, which obviously a lot of people in the Make America Great Again movement, that they see this as more of a prize than anything else, especially calling Donald Trump the king of the ultra MAGAs. I mean, it's the worst insult. But I think it's fair to say that the real ultras in this story are those who want and actively work to put criminals back on the streets as quickly as possible. And what I want to know is, how can Democrats really justify making the streets less safe in the name of social justice? Because who is that justice for? It's certainly not the folks who are being beaten, robbed, raped, and even murdered. Your thoughts?
Well, it's hard to believe they couldn't see that before they pursued their soft on crime policies. They're experimenting with the lives of the inner city residents. They're experimenting with a outlying criminal justice theory about trying to empty the jails as much as they can, with the idea that, hey, society shouldn't want to have a lot of people incarcerated. And that's true, but we need to, because there's a lot of criminals. I mean, that's why we have laws to limit people's unbridled behavior and try to prevent it from happening again. And the way to do that is not to let more people get away with it.
And that's a lesson that more progressive DAs might be learning very, very soon, Tim. Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
Coming up later in the show, we talk the coming demise of progressive DAs. But up next, why did French and American relations go so badly after D-Day? Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
This last week marked the anniversary of D-Day, where boats landed in Normandy to begin the final pushback against Adolf Hitler. And since then, it's fair to say that relations between France and the United States have been somewhat strained. Well, to expand on this not so special relationship, we're joined by a resident expert in all things defense, Mr. Dave Patterson. Bonjour, Dave.
Bonjour, Mark.
Should we do this whole thing in French?
we Americans have issued French for a very long time.
All right. So, Dave, our listeners are no doubt aware that I personally I'm from England, and my country has a roughly 1,000-year history of fighting the French in one battle or this war or another war. But how does the French-American relationship stand right now?
Well, I think it's been an off again, on again relationship. I mean, during the French and Indian War, we were somewhat miffed by their taking up with the Indians. But on the other hand, during the Revolutionary War, the French came to our aid. And so it's been.
You do realize that they only did that to annoy the English.
I know that. I know that. But then, the Germans came on board, the Hessians came on board to annoy us. So I think it's all kind of come out in the wash during the late 1700s. But at the same time, the French have had their problems with their revolution. And so that kind of took their time. And of course, then there was the number of wars during the 1800s in Europe that the United States thoughtfully did not get into. But I think that where most recently things have gone awry started after World War II, although the French people have been extraordinarily gracious after World War II, D-Day's invasion and the liberation of France. But the French government has been somewhat less cordial. And I think that a lot of it has to do with Charles de Gaulle, quite frankly. And I mean, he although he had a rather major part to play in the liberation of Paris, without much effort on his part, I might add. But nonetheless, after World War II was over, Charles de Gaulle wanted to reassert the prominence of France without much in the way of substance to do that. He thought that perhaps his role in NATO would bring more prominence, but when that showed not to be true, and the United States and Great Britain levied the rules and regulations for the use of nuclear weapons on France. In other words, neither the United States nor UK nor France would be able to use any nuclear weapons without agreement by all three, and that did not set well with de Gaulle.
Well, I think it's interesting that you talk about de Gaulle, because Macron really sees himself as the next de Gaulle, I think.
I'd say of all of the French personalities that he might want to model himself out, de Gaulle may not be the one I would certainly choose.
No, I mean in terms of the grandeur of his position. I mean, this is the guy who said that he would rule in a Jupiterian manner, sitting on high and casting out his orders. And I think UK relationship has gone downhill in recent years with President Macron, because he's been pushing to bolster support for the European Union rather than for, as reflected in the recent election, which he did win, but there was such a nationalistic uprising against him that it was a very close run thing for a while there. But now, in his words, when Britain left the EU, he's been seeking to, and these are his words, punish the UK for leaving. Now, is it perhaps this attitude that makes France really much a social outcast in terms of international politics? Or is it because France is within the EU so heavily that it's ceded its own authority?
Well, first of all, I think that the comment was a bit cheeky. But nonetheless, I think that it kind of represents the way France sees themselves in the world. And we've experienced that, obviously, in 1986, when Great Britain graciously allowed us to fly our F-111s out of airfields in British airfields and to bomb Libya. You'll
Bryce
recall
Norton, I believe. Bryce Norton Air Base.
Bryce Norton, Lakenheath,
Yeah.
yes. And
terrible accommodation there, by the way. Just terrible.
I'll take your. Well, actually, I have had accommodation there, and I didn't
like it.
Oh,
Sorry,
did you have a
continue.
Batman? Huh?
No.
Oh, there you go.
I barely had a Robin.
But I think that kind of put a wedge between France and the United States when they did not allow the F-111s to fly over France in the bombing raid, and caused us to go around them with a number of additional air refuelings. And then in 9/11, when the French didn't participate in the coalition against Iraq, I think that was not helpful to the relationship. But as a good friend, Jed Babin, who was a writer for the Washington Times, said, frankly, going to war without France is like going to war or going to deer hunting without an accordion. You just leave a lot of noisy baggage behind.
Yeah, that's become quite a famous one. There's also, I recall growing up hearing about the freedom fries that were readily available in fast food establishments.
We did. We'll get them. We're quite good at punishing our detractors.
Now,
I think most recently, though, Mark, we have to say that the submarine deal with Australia has really set them off. But they had to realize, the 2016 deal with France, between France and Australia for a $39 billion deal, I might add, with France for diesel submarines. And the way I characterize it is that France sold submarines. The Trump administration negotiated with Australia to establish nuclear submarine capability in the Indo-Pacific region. So there was a bit of a difference in motivation between, I think, France and the UK and the US in its relationship with Australia. Also, it brings Australia really into the nuclear submarine community and gives them a much greater capability than the diesel submarines would have.
Dave, I'd like to leave you with a little anecdote that I heard. Now, it's certainly not true, but I think it speaks to the issue. And it goes, there was an elderly gentleman recently going through customs in France, and he didn't have his passport with him. And the French clerk, the border clerk there, said, "Well, you're not part of the EU. Don't you know that you need a passport to enter France?" And the old man said, "Well, the last time I came through here, I landed in Normandy, and there wasn't a Frenchman in sight." Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Hey, Mark, great to be with you. Au revoir.
Au revoir. You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'd like to extend a special thank you to our listeners in Brownwood, Texas, on KXYL 1240 AM and 102.3 FM. Thanks for being here. Coming up later in the show, we talk George Soros's expensive district attorneys. But up next, is Joe Biden trying to pull off a Wizard of Oz style deceit? We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
President Biden and his White House friends assure us that things have never been better. All is well with the world, and that his presidency is one of the most effective and impactful in history. Well, this will certainly be news to the vast majority of Americans who say otherwise. Is Joe Biden attempting to pull a Wizard of Oz deceit? Well, to help us pull back that particular curtain, we're joined by author and economist who happens to never have seen The Wizard of Oz, Mr. Andrew Moran. Ahoy, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I can't stand that song, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. It's probably the third worst song behind Time to Say Goodbye and that Mariah Carey Christmas song.
I can't believe you said that about Andrea Bocelli. That is Andrea Bocelli's Conte Partiro. Beautiful piece, beautifully sung, and you should be ashamed of yourself. So, Andrew, back to the plot. What's the deal? Biden and the White House tell us how well everything is going in the Emerald City. What's the truth?
Well, if you watch that press conference with Jean-Pierre, she was saying, oh, this is such a historically great economy. But the data suggests otherwise. I mean, aside from the labor market, which is quite strong, everything else is abysmal. I mean, just recently, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, their GDP now model was declined again to 0.9% for the second quarter projections.
That's recession talk, isn't it? Am I right in thinking?
Yeah, it is. And the GDP now, I mean, of all the estimates, I think that is the most accurate one. They're off by about maybe 3 percentage points, but that's about it. So it keeps going down week after week. So perhaps recession. Other economic data is also abysmal. I mean, the personal savings rates collapsed. Consumer credit growth is surging again. I mean, just the latest one, I don't know if you saw it, the May numbers, nearly $40 billion growth. That this is astounding. It shows how inflation is eating away savings, forcing people to tap into credit cards, and their wage growth is being annihilated by the higher cost of living.
Yeah, so things don't actually seem as rosy as the president insists. Now, is this insistence that everything is going well and to not believe your lying eyes, is it all just posturing to try and sway that small percentage of people who aren't particularly impacted by inflation, and perhaps to try and pass off the whole debacle as a Trump-inspired plot at destabilization through misinformation? Does that make sense?
Well, there's two things. First is that inflation impacts pretty much everyone except the ultra wealthy, and then that's the very people that the White House keeps blaming inflation. Those are the people that are donating to Joe Biden. And that's why I think he needs to keep this mantra up. And he insists that they're the fault for inflation, which is why you need to raise their taxes for whatever reason. And the second thing, too, I mean, that's just politics. I mean, both parties are going to do that. I mean, no matter how bad the economy is, that's the White House job, is to say, oh, we're doing such a great job and the economy is doing well. And, inflation isn't really much of a problem. You just buy yourself a $50,000 electric vehicle and everything is great. So, I mean, I don't blame them. That's what Washington politics is about. You're not going to see the president go on national TV and say, you know what? It's my fault. Everything is my fault. I'm terribly sorry. You have my resignation letter. Yeah, there was a senator in the last couple of days. I can't remember where she represents, but she said she was driving through Michigan and she was passing all these gas stations, and she thought, it doesn't matter because I've got an electric car. This is your solution, peons out there. Forget your car. Just drop 60 grand on a brand new Tesla. And all your gas problems will be solved, and President Biden will win a landslide in 2024. Now, but even so, what's remarkable is that she thinks that's a solution to the country's energy woes, when that's going to further exacerbate the country's energy woes, which I'm sure we'll probably touch upon later about the blackouts. So what this woman talking about is just nonsense. It really is, but we can't really escape without talking about the gas prices, Andrew. Now, you wrote recently on the pages of LibertyNation.com, fantastic article. I recommend you all go and check it out, about the potential for $6 gasoline as a national average. How realistic is this, without giving away the plot of your article? Yeah, well, if the Liberty Nation readers certainly believe that. The recent poll found that most think that the gas price is going to go above $6 a gallon. Goldman Sachs recently came out with a research note, and they said that oil prices are going to go up to 140, but motorists are going to feel like it's $160 a barrel because gas is going to be above $6 a gallon. And this is mostly due to a couple of factors. One, of course, higher crude oil prices. But the second thing, too, are the refineries. The United States has a refinery problem. They don't have enough of it. A lot of them have shut down over the last few years, mainly because of the green agenda. So these refineries, they buy, let's say, $100 barrel of oil, but they sell it back to the consumer or business for $150. And of course, now oil price a little higher, so it's probably about 170. But overall, that's the key thing. Another thing, too, if you look at some of the certain pockets of the country, their gasoline stockpiles are diminishing. Diesel stockpiles are diminishing. You look at the EIA data, same thing, too. Cushing, Oklahoma inventories, they're falling. Gasoline inventories are falling. The country's running out of energy, and nothing's really being done to mitigate it. And it's going to worsen later in the year when a lot of these when the U.S. ships more to Europe in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Well, fortunately, there's the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which Joe Biden hasn't touched recently. Yeah, this one, and that's funny too. That is really funny because if you look at one of the press conferences he had recently, and he was saying, "Oh, my administration is tackling this problem by releasing 1 million barrels a day from the strategic reserves." That's nothing. The U.S. consumes about 18 million barrels a day. That's the problem. Another problem is that U.S. output has stagnated. It's stalled. It's still way below the peak of 13.1 million barrels a day back in February 2020. Right now, it's unchanged over the last month at 11.8 million barrels. So the country's not producing as much as it needs, and to satisfy domestically and foreign.
Yeah, that foreign will go up a lot, especially as Joe Biden's made commitments to provide oil to Europe, so Europe can avoid buying from Russia.
Well, it's not only oil, natural gas. That's the key thing. They're shipping a lot. Yeah, they're going to be shipping a lot more. And if you look at some of the weekly storage numbers from the EIA, it's way below the 5-year average of that the U.S. typically has. So trying to keep up with summer demand, the cooling demand, and then winter's heating demand, which I think is going to be the big story in the coming months, that's going to be difficult to do.
Well, that is a brilliant segue for us, Andrew, because I'm sure we've all heard the rumors about blackouts coming this summer, or as you posit just now, possibly more into winter. Mm-hmm. But before we get into specifics, is it fair to say that Joe Biden's one job was to keep the lights on? I think that's fair. I mean, at heart, if you're sitting at home in the darkness waiting for your turn at the energy spigot, there is no way you're thinking to yourself, gee, what a great president. Can't wait to cast another vote for him. Really, he's failed at his one major job, right? Keeping the lights on. Or am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right, because the country's, I mean, if he facilitated an environment of saying, okay, let's drill, baby, drill, we're gonna do our green energy, but at the same time, right now we have to solve our immediate problems, which is having enough energy, then you can give kudos to him. But he's not doing that. I mean, he's canceling the federal land leases for oil and gas drilling. That's terrible. He's shipping more energy to Europe, which the U.S. can't afford coming in the coming months. So overall, and then another thing too is that energy companies have such a difficult time producing or drilling for oil because of all the litigation that happens. They don't believe the administration has their back in court. You have the environmentalists protesting all the time. And then, trying to get investment, that's even more hard because everyone's focusing on ESG and sustainable investing and green. So the fossil fuel industries, they're going through tough times right now. I mean, of course, not if you're an investor. If you're an investor, you're going through great times. But for the rest of the country that's not buying ExxonMobil stock, they're going through a rough period.
All right, Andrew, one final question for you, and it need to be a quick one, if I may.
Sure.
What could cause these blackouts? What policies led to it? And is there a candle at the end of the tunnel?
Well, you're going to need candles definitely in the coming months, so that's for sure. But anyway, I think it's a variety of reasons. One of them is that a lot of these power grids, they've invested so much on renewables, wind and solar, but that's not enough to satisfy demand. Lack of production, lackluster activity, that's an issue. Just government mismanagement. You look at Gavin Newsom in California. He's already warning the public that, hey, we're going to have blackouts for the next 3 years, but it's worth it because we're going to be investing in renewable energy to give us power for the next generations to come. So I think that is the key issue. But nobody's willing to postpone that or delay that because they're just so fascinated with their green fetish. So it's a multitude of factors.
Andrew, I'll leave you with a quick gag, if I may. What did socialists use before candles?
It was light bulbs, right? Is that the joke?
Electricity. Andrew Moran, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, we talk expensive district attorneys and the growing American crime wave. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Crime in America is surging, and it looks like politicians and courts are all for it, or at least that's how it seems. With progressive district attorneys on the out and light sentences for criminals, we have to ask, what's gone wrong? Well, we're fortunate to be joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire, to answer this question. Welcome back, Scott.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you for having me.
So tell me, Scott, we had a swath of progressive district attorneys come into office courtesy of the big dollar donations from Mr. George Soros, no less. They swept the field when they came in, and now the public appears to be reaping what they sowed with their votes. What went wrong?
Or right, depending on your point of view.
Well, crime is up, so we can assume that it's something that's gone wrong.
Well, if that's your measure of success, then yes, I'm suggesting that perhaps for Mr. Soros, that's not the measure of success. So he might disagree. I was looking just as you were asking the question, I saw reported somewhere earlier today. There we go. Soros spent $40 million to elect 75 social justice prosecutors, according to a recently published report. Mark, now that's actually, I think, quite a bargain. In other words, electorally, I think first of all we have to say that was
it's bang for your buck.
The return on investment. Yeah. Soros does not disappoint. He's great at that. And this real rebuke that Chesa Boudin, I guess, is the pronunciation for the San Francisco DA that was just trounced 60-40, as you reported on LibertyNation.com. That's really an outlier, as I've been watching these Soros DA races come up. That some of them are close, some of them aren't, but we haven't seen them just tossed out on their ear like this. I think it's probably. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I actually think it's this particular one with Mr. Chesa Boudin. I think this will be the impetus that pushes other ones. I mean, there's already one in action for George Gascon of Los Angeles, district attorney there, and he, the people working against for his recall, they already have reported 500,000 signatures and are roughly 60,000 shy with roughly 1 month to go. So I think that what we might see is, because the people who organize these kind of things see that it's been possible with Mr. Boudin, that it's quite likely to happen with Mr. Gascon, especially considering the negative publicity for the light sentences he's been receiving recently.
You feel like if San Francisco can reject a progressive DA, then that can happen anywhere. Although he was perhaps the most progressive in the sense of allowing the most really awful kind of lifestyle crimes to I mean, if you can't walk out your front door without having someone use your front walk as a toilet, say what you will about liberty, that's a bridge too far in anybody's case, I think.
I can almost guarantee you that Californian politicians, they don't have the walkway right outside their front door. There's some nice big gates there to keep people at least 100 yards away.
I wonder about that. I thought that in San Francisco, though, that's not true. And it really is this, ivory tower kind of, well, that's not the right analogy, sort of like they're gilded cages that the streets are full of problems, and that there aren't, it's not like, some communities have gated communities literally that, they can just keep out undesirable elements. But I don't think that's true in San Francisco or in some of these other cities that we read about.
It seems at least the 60% of the electorate agree with your analysis, Scott.
Yeah,
very certainly. And that kind of brings us nicely to talking about light sentencing, is that there were 2 New York attorneys who firebombed a police car and now have received let's be fair, it's a very, very generous plea deal. Could you give us the details on that?
Well, it's much more than just a generous plea deal. This concerns Colin Ford.
It's Mattis. A lottery win plea deal.
Well, even more than that, Mark, because the lead is that they actually already had a plea deal in place that was just reduced without benefit to the government. So in other words, if you make a plea deal for, let's just say, put a time out of the blue and just say 5 years, okay? And you've already done whatever you need to do to satisfy that 5-year term. In other words, you've given evidence against yourself and others, perhaps. You've signed a confession, and you've avoided the expense of a trial, and everything's set to go. And then the government comes back and says, well, we know we said we were going to give you 5, but you know what? It turns out we're going to give you 1 instead of 5. And you didn't do anything to sweeten the deal for the. It's not like you said, oh, by the way, I'm also going to give you this other, rat on somebody else or some other benefit sort of for the bargain. Then you have to ask, why is this happening? Now, I just want to get the other name on board. It's Colin Ford Mattis and Uruj Rahman, who were the lawyers who passed out Molotov cocktails and threw a Molotov cocktail into, I think it was an occupied police car?
I don't know if it was occupied, but it was on active duty. So it wasn't as though it was just held up at a garage being repaired and they threw it in. It was out there trying to control the riots. Sorry, the mostly peaceful riots that were taking place.
Mostly peaceful, but not on account of
mostly peaceful Molotov cocktails.
Madison Rahman's actions, both directly firebombing the car and also passing out firebombs for others to throw. So in contrast, we have these multiple January 6th defendants whose literal crime was entering a building that they didn't have legal permission to be in and then remaining there for some time. I'm not talking about anybody who beat a security guard or pepper sprayed anybody or broke down a door. I'm talking about people who walked into a building that had a door that was open to them, not legally speaking open, but physically open to them, and stood there. And they're doing time on the notion that the Justice Department has said that even though they may never have committed a crime before, and this may be the only time they've ever been charged with a crime, they may even be in their 60s and pillars of their community. Nevertheless, Mark, the import of what they did justifies a substantial term of months in federal prison. And yet that same government says that if you firebomb a police car, if you have the right politics, as it seems, and these people have the right politics and the right connections, then the government will actually be your advocate for lowering and minimizing your criminal culpability.
Now, I want to get into a few details on this.
It's scandalous, by the way.
It is scandalous. Do we know how many years they were facing from their initial plea deal?
The charge they had faced a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. And now I think the maximum is 24 months that they're possibly facing.
Okay, so now, is that a real 24 months?
Almost certainly they wouldn't serve the full 24 months. So it'd be something like a year, and who knows, maybe some time off for good behavior. It's a drastic reduction. It's the difference between, and by the way, they probably would never have served the full 10 years if they had been convicted of that. And the reason why is because of the way federal sentencing works. It's a complicated calculation, and from what we generally know about these people, they don't have a significant prior records, which is what tends to make somebody serve at the high end of that range rather than the low end. So we presume it'd be at the low end of that of a range anyway. But this goes from being a very serious, term of imprisonment to something that's decidedly less than that. And once again, only offered to favored political defendants. If they were January 6th defendants, you could expect that it wouldn't even be the 10-year charge. They'd probably add on some terrorism charge to make it like a life term, and the double standard, it's quite stark.
Scott, I have one final question for you on this, if I may. Who made the decision?
Well, we don't know. I can just tell you that my judgment, guided by experience, tells me that it was somebody very high up in the Department of Justice.
Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's almost all we have time for on this edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. A sincere thank you to our guests, Tim Donner, Andrew Moran, Dave Patterson, and Scott Cosenza, and of course you, the listeners out there. My parting shot for this week. John Milton wrote in Paradise Lost, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of a hell of a heaven." In the same respect, we can see ourselves as victims or heroes, depending on how we choose, living in our own personal heavens or hells. It seems, though, the purposeful increase in rampant crime, certain politicians want us living in the darker realm. But that's a choice that we each can make, and it's one that we all really should. Because at the end of the day, you're faced with either living your life in fear, surrounded by the sins of others as well as your own, or you can start to create something better. And perhaps not a heaven, certainly, but something that has value and inherent meaning. And that's the sad part about this almost state-sponsored crime wave. They don't want to just take your safety and your right to self-determination. They want to snuff out the very things that make life worth living. And that just can't be allowed. That's hell right there. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
Maybe tracking polls sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and others.
I can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.